The sound was what woke me, a low, grinding growl that ripped right through the quiet of 5 a.m. and vibrated up through the floorboards. It was a sound of violation, like teeth chewing on bone. I threw the covers off, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't a nightmare. The sound was real, and it was coming from my front yard. I ran to the window, my bare feet cold on the old wood, and my blood turned to ice. A huge yellow bulldozer was methodically tearing down my stone wall, not just knocking it over, eating it. Great chunks of 19th century granite, the very reason I bought this house, were tumbling into a pile of rubble. And standing there on the lawn, bathed in the cold wash of the machine's headlights, was Karen, president of our Homeowners Association. She had her arms crossed, a smug, satisfied little smile playing on her lips, like a queen watching a very satisfying execution. This wasn't just a disagreement. This is the kind of story you hear about, the kind you watch on channels like Karenology. Only this time, it was my front yard, my history being turned to dust. I didn't even bother with shoes. I stormed out onto the porch, the damp morning air hitting me like a slap. "Karen, what in God's name are you doing?" She didn't even flinch. She just turned her head, that smile never leaving her face. "Morning, Alex. Just a little community improvement. The board voted. This eyesore violates 3 different covenants." She said the word covenants like it was a sacred text. The operator in the cab of the bulldozer wouldn't look at me. He just kept his eyes on his work, another chunk of the wall collapsing with a sickening crunch. I could smell the sharp stink of diesel mixing with the sweet, clean scent of morning dew. It was the smell of progress, I guess. The kind of progress that paves over anything with a soul. My old geological hammer, my Estwing, was sitting on the small porch table, a gift from my mentor 30 years ago. It looked small and useless, a relic from a time when things were built to last, not torn down on a whim. Karen stepped forward and handed me a piece of paper. "Here's the official notice, and the initial fine. It'll be $500 a day until the debris is cleared, by a licensed contractor, of course." I stared at the paper, then at the ruins of my wall. The wall wasn't just rocks. As a geologist I knew, I'd studied them. They were hand-cut, hauled from a local quarry that had been defunct since the 1880s. They told a story of the family who built this farm, a story that was now being erased by a woman in tastefully matching activewear. Have you ever felt that kind of helpless rage, that feeling of being completely railroaded in your own home? If you have, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if this is hitting close to home, go ahead and hit that like button, because it only got worse from there. "You can't do this," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Oh, I can," she purred, her smile finally reaching her eyes. It was a cold, empty light. "I warned you I was going to clean up this neighborhood." Then she turned and walked away, her steps confident on the grass. The paper in my hand wasn't just a fine. It was an invitation to a slaughter, my slaughter, and it was scheduled for that evening. The community clubhouse that night felt less like a meeting and more like an ambush. The air was thick with cheap coffee and self-righteousness. I walked in, clutching a folder with my property deed and a printout of the Historical Society's initial assessment of the wall. I thought I was prepared. I thought logic and facts still meant something. That was my first mistake. Karen was already at the podium, basking in the fluorescent lights. She let me take a seat before she began, giving everyone a moment to stare at me. The prodigal son. The troublemaker. "As you all know," she started, her voice dripping with fake concern, "we had to take decisive action this morning regarding a significant covenant violation at Mr. Jensen's property." She gestured toward me. "We don't take these things lightly." Then she clicked a button. A projector flickered to life, displaying a map on the wall. It was a property survey map of my lot. Or what was supposed to be my lot. I felt my stomach clench. The property line on her map was wrong. It was shifted by about 10 feet, making it look like my wall was built squarely on community land. "As you can see," she said, pointing a laser at the fraudulent line, "this structure was a blatant encroachment." Murmurs rippled through the room. People were nodding. Of course they were. It was on a screen. It had lines and numbers. It had to be true. I stood up. "That map is a fake. I have the official county survey right here." Karen just smiled that same empty smile. "Ah, yes, the documents, but we also have this." She clicked again. The image on the screen changed. It was a video, a grainy, pixelated clip from my own doorbell camera. It showed me, wild-eyed and shoeless, screaming at the bulldozer operator that morning. They'd cut the audio of what he said, of what Karen said. It was just me, a 50-year-old man losing his mind. She'd edited it into a greatest hits of my fury. The final shot was a close-up of my face, twisted in rage. The board has also voted to levy a $15,000 fine for aggressive and threatening behavior toward a community contractor, she announced to the silent room. Plus, the $500 daily fee still stands. The room was dead quiet. I could hear the hum of the old projector. I looked around at the faces, my neighbors, people I'd shared a beer with, whose kids I'd given candy to on Halloween. Now they looked at me like I was a rabid dog. In the span of 12 hours, I had lost my wall, $15,000, and my place in the world. I was an outcast. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain, but no words came out. I just sank back into my chair, the heat of their judgment burning my face. The next morning, the silence was louder than the bulldozer had been. The video of my meltdown, as they were calling it, had made the rounds in the community's private social media group. The post was titled, "Is our new neighbor a danger to the community?" The comments were a bloodbath. He always seemed weird. I heard he lost a big job once for being unstable. My kids play on that street. It was a digital witch trial, and I was guilty. When I went to get my mail, Mrs. Davison from across the street, a woman who had brought me a welcome to the neighborhood pecan pie just 3 months earlier, saw me, and her friendly wave froze midair. She turned and hurried back inside her house. That hurt more than the $15,000 fine. My work was the next casualty. I'm a consulting geologist. My reputation is everything. By noon, my website was flooded with 1-star reviews. They weren't even clever, just things like unprofessional, aggressive attitude, wouldn't trust him. My inquiry form, which usually brought in a few leads a week, was silent. My income flatlined. I spent the afternoon sitting on my porch steps, staring at the pile of stones that used to be my wall. It felt like looking at a tomb. That's when a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see my next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a retired plumber in his 70s with hands like worn leather gloves. He was holding 2 bottles of beer. He didn't say anything. He just handed one to me, sat down on the step, and let out a long, slow sigh. He was the only person who had looked me in the eye all day. "Rough day," he finally said, taking a sip. "Yeah," I replied. That was all I could manage. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the cicadas start their evening song. Then he pointed with his bottle toward his lawn, which looked a little too green, a little too spongy in one corner. "Funny thing," he said, his voice low. "Ever since Karen started her beautification projects, my sump pump's been working overtime, and half the folks on this end of the street are complaining their basement smelled damp. Never had that problem before." It was an offhand comment, a simple observation from a man who spent his life understanding how water moves. But for me, a geologist who understands what the ground holds, it was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. I stood up, the beer forgotten in my hand. I walked over to the edge of my lawn, near the ruins of the wall, and looked at the ground. Really looked at it. It wasn't just about a wall anymore. It was never about the wall. Something else was happening here, right under our feet. And I suddenly knew that the answer wasn't in any courthouse. It was in the dirt. My geological hammer finally had a purpose again. For the next 2 days, I was a man possessed. I took soil samples all over my property, and, under the cover of darkness, from the edges of my neighbors' yards. Henderson was right. The soil was super saturated. It was heavy, greasy clay, holding water like a sponge. This wasn't normal for our area, not even after a heavy rain. Something was actively feeding water into the ground. I pulled out my original site plans and overlaid them with old county hydrological maps Henderson had helped me find online. That's when I saw it. An old agricultural drainage system, a network of clay pipes, and a large concrete cistern was marked as abandoned on maps from the 1930s. It ran directly beneath our properties, and Karen's new, supposedly state-of-the-art drainage system, installed by her preferred contractor, intersected with that old cistern. There was no record of it being properly decommissioned or filled. They just ignored it, or worse. Armed with this new theory, I felt a flicker of hope. I carefully bagged the stone samples from my wall and the soil cores, labeled everything, and drove down to the county museum. I met with a man named Dr. Albright, the head curator. He was a small, excitable man with a passion for local history. When I laid the stones on his table, his eyes lit up. He ran his fingers over the tool marks. "Oh my," he breathed. "This is from the old Miller quarry. The stone, the cut. This is from the original Miller homestead. We're talking 1830s. This is a significant find, Mr. Jensen, a legitimate local landmark." He promised to fast-track a certification. He was going to write a letter, contact the State Historical Preservation Office. For the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe. I had him. I had Karen, a certified historical landmark. She wouldn't be able to touch it. She'd have to rebuild the wall at the Homeowners Association's expense. The fines would be voided. It was the silver bullet. I went home and actually slept through the night. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in ages. I made coffee and waited for the official email from Albright. My phone finally rang around 10 a.m. It was him. But the excited energy in his voice was gone, replaced by a defeated, reedy tone. "Alex, Mr. Jensen, I'm so sorry," he began. "There's been a complication." I felt my stomach drop. "What complication?" "One of our museum's board members," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "is a silent partner in the development firm that's been acquiring land on the edge of our community. The same firm that Karen has been working with. He strongly advised that we distance ourselves from this controversy. He mentioned your instability." He cleared his throat. "The museum is officially withdrawing its assessment. As far as we're concerned, it's just an old stone wall." The line went dead. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a perfectly executed counterattack. She hadn't just beaten me, she'd used my own hope as a weapon against me. And in the community chat, a new post from Karen appeared. "So glad the museum agreed with us. Now we can finally move forward with making our neighborhood safe and beautiful." She was dancing on the grave of my victory. That was my breaking point. Have you ever been pushed so far that you just snap? Not in a loud, screaming way, but in a quiet, cold, terrifyingly calm way. All the fight just drained out of me. I was done. I spent the next day in a fog, mechanically going through the motions of contacting a real estate agent. I was going to sell. Let Karen have her plastic, perfect little kingdom. Let her build her cheap townhouses on the land she was so obviously clearing for her developer buddies. I didn't care anymore. I sat on my porch, the for sale sign lying on the ground next to me, waiting to be hammered into the lawn. I was just staring at my old Estwing hammer, the one my mentor, Dr. Miles, had given me when I got my degree. He was a tough old bird, a geologist who had worked in some of the most remote places on Earth. I remembered something he'd told me once, after I'd made a huge mistake on a survey in the middle of nowhere. I was ready to quit, just like now. He'd put a hand on my shoulder and said, "The Earth doesn't lie, Alex. People lie. Instruments can be wrong. But the Earth, she always tells the truth. You just have to be smart enough to ask the right question." And then it hit me, like a physical blow. I'd been asking the wrong question. I was so focused on the wall, on history, on proving I was right. But the real story wasn't about the past. It was about the present. It was about the water. Here's what really happened. The beautification wasn't about aesthetics. It was about creating a problem, the flooding, that only Karen's chosen contractor could solve for an exorbitant price. And my wall was just in the way of the next phase. But the linchpin of the whole scam was that hidden waterlogged cistern. My phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "You were right about the contracts. She cut me out of the new phase. The community safety fair is this Saturday. She's getting an award. It's her big show. You should go." I knew instantly who it was. Bob, one of the other board members. A greedy little man who was only quiet as long as he was getting his cut. Karen had gotten too confident and betrayed one of her own. And in doing so, she'd given me the stage. My mind started racing. A public fair, hundreds of people, the media, and Karen on a stage, accepting an award for community safety. Oh, the irony was just too perfect. I picked up my geological hammer. It didn't feel so useless anymore. A plan, a wild, audacious, beautiful plan began to form in my mind. It was time to stop talking to people. It was time to let the earth speak for itself. The next 48 hours were a blur of meticulous preparation. I didn't need a lawyer, I needed a pump, 100 feet of hose, and 20 gallons of the brightest, most obnoxiously green, biodegradable water-tracing dye I could find. Mr. Henderson, my 70-year-old plumber accomplice, looked at the containers of green liquid in my garage and just slowly shook his head, a huge grin spreading across his face. "Son," he said, "you are certifiably insane. I'm in." The community safety fair was exactly as awful as I'd imagined. Bouncy castles, hot dog stands, and a big stage set up right in the middle of the park's central lawn. The whole town was there. Karen was in her element, flitting from group to group, accepting praise, her face a mask of civic devotion. She was wearing a crisp white pantsuit, a bold choice considering. I found Bob, my anonymous informant, near the kettle corn stand. He looked nervous, avoiding my eyes. "The main water pump for the park's sprinkler system is in that utility shed," he muttered, nodding toward a small brick building. "The key is, misplaced, but the lock is old." He slipped away before I could thank him. At 2 p.m., the awards ceremony began. The mayor was there, giving a speech about civic heroes. I saw the local news camera pan across the crowd. Henderson gave me a subtle nod from his position near a fire hydrant at the far end of the park. It was time. While everyone's attention was on the stage, I slipped over to the utility shed. A few moments of work with a tension wrench, and the old lock clicked open. Inside, I connected my pump and hose to the park's main water line. The other end of the hose disappeared into a storm drain that I knew fed directly into the compromised drainage system Karen's contractor had installed. Then, I upended the first 10-gallon drum of green dye into my pump's feeder tank. I walked back to the edge of the crowd just as the mayor was calling Karen to the stage to accept her plaque for outstanding contributions to neighborhood safety. The applause was polite. Karen took the microphone, her smile beaming. "Thank you, Mayor. I'm just so proud of what we can accomplish when we work together to make our community safer and more beautiful for our children." I pulled out my phone and sent a one-word text to Henderson. "Now." From his position across the park, Henderson twisted the operating nut on the fire hydrant. A jet of water surged into the park system, and my pump, drawing from that pressure, began to mainline gallons of neon green water directly into the faulty drainage network. Back on stage, Karen was in the middle of a sentence about property values. I walked forward, right to the edge of the stage. The news camera, sensing a confrontation, swung toward me. "I have a question for our award winner," I said, my voice calm and clear. It carried across the silent park. Karen's smile tightened. "Alex, this is hardly the time or the place." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time and place," I said, looking out at the crowd. "You see, Karen has done so much to improve our community's water management. She's assured us her new drainage system is state-of-the-art, routing all excess water safely away. So I thought, why not a public demonstration, a live test, you could say?" People were murmuring, confused. What would you do in that moment? Would you trust the woman in the white suit holding a plaque, or the crazy guy who screams at bulldozers? "If the system works as designed," I announced, "all this water is now flowing harmlessly into the creek a half-mile from here. But if it doesn't..." I let the sentence hang in the air. And then it began. A small dark green patch appeared on the pristine lawn, right in front of the stage. Then another and another. Within seconds, the ground at Karen's feet began to ooze a slimy, supernatural-looking green liquid. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The bright green dye, the blood of her lie, was seeping up from the earth. Then, with a gurgle, a small geyser of green water erupted from a sprinkler head, soaking the front row of spectators. The final glorious moment came from a hairline crack in the foundation of the clubhouse, right behind the stage. A trickle of green became a stream, running over the pristine concrete. Karen stared, her mouth open, the plaque for neighborhood safety still in her hand. The news camera zoomed in on the green water pooling around her immaculate white shoes. The representative from the developer's bank, who was standing in the front row, went pale. He pulled out his phone and started making a call, his face a mask of fury. The game wasn't just over, it was annihilated. In the end, I didn't have to say a word. The earth had spoken for me. The chaos that erupted was a beautiful, glorious thing. For a moment, everyone was frozen. Then, a woman in the front row shrieked as green water soaked her designer handbag. Kids started laughing and pointing. The news cameraman, realizing he was capturing gold, didn't move an inch, his lens fixed on Karen. Her face had gone through a rapid-fire series of emotions: shock, rage, and finally, a sort of blank, crumbling horror. The white pantsuit was ruined, with a creeping green stain spreading up from the cuffs. Her reign was over, and it had drowned in a puddle of her own making. The mayor, stammering apologies, was whisked away by an aide. The bank guy was already in his car, peeling out of the parking lot. 2 board members helped a catatonic Karen off the stage, shielding her from the camera. I just stood there, letting the sweet, sweet feeling of victory wash over me. I had won. It was done. I had exposed the rot, and now the healing could begin. I went home that night and slept like a stone, the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. The next day I don't know what I expected. A phone call from the mayor? A fruit basket from my grateful neighbors? What I got was a certified letter taped to my front door. It was a summons for an emergency homeowners association meeting that evening. The topic: urgent review of community security protocols and unauthorized resident actions. I laughed. Of course. The board had to do its due diligence, formally remove Karen, and start the cleanup process. I ironed a shirt, feeling generous. I decided I wouldn't even ask for them to pay for my ruined wall. Seeing Karen's face had been payment enough. When I walked into the clubhouse, the atmosphere was wrong. It wasn't celebratory. It was tense, cold, funereal. The same neighbors who had watched the Green Water Show were there, but they weren't looking at me with gratitude. They were looking at me with fear. And at the head of the table, not in the president's chair, but in a regular seat, was Karen. She wasn't wearing white. She was in a severe black dress, her hair pulled back tightly. She looked like a widow at her husband's funeral, a husband she had murdered. The interim president, a nervous man named Gary, cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss the events of Saturday." He looked at his notes. "While the board acknowledges Mr. Jensen brought certain infrastructural issues to light, the manner in which he did so has caused considerable concern." Karen spoke, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He trespassed on community property. He illegally accessed the park's water main. He introduced an unauthorized substance into our environment." She slid a stack of papers across the table. "This is the preliminary invoice from an environmental cleanup crew for the decontamination of the park. $25,000. My jaw dropped. "But that's not the real issue," she continued, her eyes locking onto mine. "The real issue is the pattern of unstable and aggressive behavior." She nodded to Gary. He clicked a button and the projector whirred to life. It was the same video from before, me screaming at the bulldozer, the greatest hits of my rage. This is a man who, when he doesn't get his way, takes matters into his own hands. Yesterday, it was green dye. What is it tomorrow? What if one of your children had been playing near that hydrant? What if he decides he doesn't like your dog barking or the color of your car? You could feel the mood in the room shift. She was a master. She had lost the battle over the facts, so she had changed the battlefield to fear. Have you ever seen someone so skillfully turn a crowd? It's a terrifying thing to witness. "The board has voted," Gary mumbled, not looking at me. "The original $15,000 fine for aggressive behavior stands. The cost of the cleanup, $25,000, is levied against your property. And we are issuing a formal censure for conduct endangering the community." He pushed a single sheet of paper toward me. The total at the bottom was $40,000, but it was the sentence underneath that stopped my heart. "Failure to remit payment in 30 days will result in the board pursuing all legal options, including a forced sale of the property to resolve the debt and remove the ongoing threat." I looked up from the paper and stared at Karen. Her face was a perfect calm mask, but her eyes were burning with triumphant hatred. I had taken her crown. So, she had decided to take my whole world. I walked out of that clubhouse into the cool night air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The victory I had felt just 24 hours earlier had turned to ash in my mouth. $40,000, a forced sale. She wasn't just trying to punish me. She was trying to erase me. I got in my car and just drove, with no destination in mind, the streetlights blurring past the windows. The world had become a hostile alien landscape. The next morning, the silence was back, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of shunning, it was the silence of fear. People weren't just avoiding me, they were locking their doors when I walked by. The censure for conduct endangering the community had been posted on the community message board. I was no longer just the crank who yelled at bulldozers. I was a public menace, a loose cannon. My one-star reviews online were now interspersed with comments like, "This man is a menace to society," and "I wouldn't let him near my property." My career wasn't just on hold, it was dead. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to find a way out. I called a lawyer, a guy who specialized in homeowners association disputes. He listened patiently to my story, made sympathetic noises, and then quoted me a $10,000 retainer just to start fighting the fines. "And honestly, Alex," he said, "they've got you on the trespassing and tampering. The context doesn't matter as much as you think in these cases. The board has a lot of power. $10,000 I didn't have. To fight a battle I would probably lose. It was hopeless." I was sitting on my porch staring at the pile of rubble that was once my wall when Mr. Henderson appeared again. This time, he wasn't carrying beers. He was carrying a thick, dusty book. It was an old municipal code book from the 70s. "Found this at a library sale years ago," he said, setting it down on the table next to my geological hammer. "Thought it was interesting, back before this whole area was one big homeowners association. It was just a collection of individual properties. Different rules back then." He didn't stay. He just gave me a nod and walked back to his house. I flipped through the brittle yellowed pages, the smell of old paper filling the air. It was mostly boring bureaucratic language about zoning, setbacks, and utility easements. I almost gave up, but then a particular chapter caught my eye: historical preservation and unincorporated county land. I read it once, then twice. My heart started to beat a little faster. Let me back up. Before our neighborhood was a neatly packaged development with a fancy gate and an overzealous board, it was just county land. And according to this old code, any structure built before the county was officially incorporated in 1952, especially one with demonstrable historical significance, was grandfathered in under a different set of rules. It couldn't be altered or removed without a review by a county-level historical commission, not a local HOA board. The code had been superseded by new laws, of course, but it had a clause, a tiny little footnote. Any pre-existing designations could only be overturned by a formal public hearing. My wall wasn't just old stones. It was a pre-incorporation structure, but how could I prove it? Albright, my museum contact, had been neutralized. The board wouldn't listen. I needed something official, something undeniable. I needed a time machine. Then my eyes fell on my hammer. The Est-wing. And an idea, a crazy long-shot idea, began to form. Every quarry, like a fingerprint, has a unique geochemical signature, the specific blend of feldspar, quartz, and mica in the granite. It's a signature that doesn't change over centuries. The old Miller quarry had been closed for over 100 years, but it was still there, just a few miles away, a forgotten scar on the landscape. If I could match the signature of my wall to the signature of that quarry, I would have my proof. It wasn't a deed or a map. It was something better. It was the Earth's own testimony, written in stone. I grabbed my hammer and a sample bag. The hunt was on. Finding the old Miller quarry was harder than I thought. It was just a footnote on a faded map, swallowed by decades of forest growth. I spent a full day hiking through dense woods, fighting off mosquitoes and thorns, following the ghost of an old service road. Finally, late in the afternoon, I found it. It wasn't much to look at, just a deep water-filled pit with sheer granite cliffs. But, to me, it was beautiful. It was a library of stone. I spent hours there, rappelling down the rock face, using my Est-wing to chip away samples. I felt alive again, back in my element. This was what I did. I read the stories that rocks tell. The sun was setting as I packed up my samples, my bag heavy with evidence. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control. Karen could manipulate people, edit videos, and twist words. But she couldn't argue with geochemistry. Back in my home lab, which is really just a glorified garage workbench, I spent the next 2 days running the analysis. I used X-ray fluorescence to get a baseline elemental composition of the quarry samples. Then, I did the same for the stones from my demolished wall. I held my breath as the data appeared on my monitor. I overlaid the two graphs. They were a perfect match. The spikes for potassium, sodium, and silica were identical. The trace elements, the little whispers of strontium and barium, lined up exactly. It was more than a match. It was a conversation across 150 years. The wall and the quarry were singing the same song. I printed out the graphs, the crisp lines of data looking more beautiful than any work of art. This was it. This was the undeniable scientific proof that my wall was built from Miller Quarry stone, placing its construction firmly in the 1880s, long before the county's incorporation. It was the key to that old, forgotten municipal code. Feeling a surge of confidence, I composed an email. I sent it to the entire Homeowners Association Board, the County Planning Commission, and, just for good measure, the local newspaper's investigative reporter. The subject line was simple: geochemical analysis and legal standing of pre-incorporation structure at 121 Oak Lane. In the email, I laid it all out. The old code, the geochemical match, and a polite but firm request for the county to convene the historical commission as required by law. I attached the spectral analysis charts. I didn't mention Karen, I didn't mention the finds. I kept it cold, factual, and scientific. I hit send and leaned back, a slow smile spreading across my face. Checkmate. The response came faster than I expected, but it wasn't from the county or the newspaper. It was an official cease and desist letter from the Homeowners Association's lawyer, delivered by courier. It was brutal. It accused me of manufacturing fraudulent data and engaging in a campaign of harassment. It claimed my so-called analysis was inadmissible amateur work. And then came the final blow. Attached to the letter was a sworn affidavit from Dr. Miles, my old mentor, the man who gave me my hammer, who taught me that the earth never lies. The affidavit stated that, in his professional opinion, the techniques I had used were prone to error, and that no credible conclusion could be drawn from my unsubstantiated home experiment. My own mentor had just called me a liar and a fraud in a legal document. I read the affidavit again, and then a third time. The words on the page swam before my eyes: prone to error, unsubstantiated. It was like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a character assassination, carried out by the one person whose opinion I valued more than anyone's. Why? How could she have gotten to him? I slumped into a chair, the lawyer's letter falling from my hand. The $40,000 fine suddenly felt insignificant. This was a deeper wound. This was the moment I truly understood the kind of enemy I was facing. Karen didn't just want to win, she wanted to burn my entire world to the ground, and she was willing to use anyone, even an old man's reputation, as fuel. The next few days were the darkest. The board, emboldened by the affidavit, scheduled the hearing for the forced sale of my house. The clock was ticking. I was completely isolated. My neighbors saw me as a menace. The professional community now saw me as a fraud. My mentor had disowned me. Have you ever been so alone that the silence in your own house feels like it's screaming at you? It's a terrible, hollow feeling. I spent hours staring at the wall, not sleeping, not eating, just replaying every mistake, every misstep. The green dye, the angry emails. I had played right into her hands, giving her all the ammunition she needed to paint me as unhinged. Late one night, I was sitting in my garage, staring at the spectral analysis charts that were now worthless. I picked up my old Estwing hammer, the weight of it familiar in my hand. I thought about Dr. Miles giving it to me. The earth doesn't lie, he had said. But he had. He had lied for her. I felt a surge of pure, white-hot anger. I wanted to smash something, to break things the way she had broken my life. My hand tightened on the hammer. I was about to hurl it against the garage wall when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Henderson. Porch, 5 minutes. I didn't want to see anyone, but I dragged myself out to the front porch. Henderson was there, holding a steaming mug. He didn't say anything about the hearing or the affidavit. He just pointed to the street. A utility truck was parked down the road, its cherry picker extended, a worker fiddling with the transformer on a power pole. They've been at it for an hour, Henderson said. Power's been flickering all day. Same thing happened last month over on Elm Street, Karen's grid modernization project. Funny how things seem to get worse after they fix them. I barely heard him. I was watching the worker. He was clumsy, dropping a tool. He had the same logo on his jacket as the men who had driven the bulldozer, Karen's preferred contractor. And as I watched, a cold, horrible thought began to form. It was so audacious, so diabolical, I almost dismissed it. The water saturation, the failing power grid. It wasn't two separate problems. It was a single coordinated strategy. The excess water in the ground wasn't just a byproduct of a cheap drainage fix. Water conducts electricity. Supersaturated soil can cause voltage leaks, overloads, and premature failure of underground cables and transformers. She wasn't just creating a plumbing problem she could get paid to fix. She was systematically degrading the entire utility infrastructure to create a much bigger, more expensive crisis. A crisis only her contractor was positioned to profit from. The beautification was the cover story. The flooding was the mechanism. The failing power grid was the payday. And my wall was just sitting on top of the next junction box they needed to access. It wasn't about me. It was never about me. I was just collateral damage in a multi-million-dollar scam. And the proof wasn't in the stones. It was in the wires. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical impact. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The random power outages, the emergency repairs, Karen's insistence on using only one contractor. It was a perfect self-sustaining cycle of manufactured crisis and profitable solution. She wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was the CEO of a disaster-for-profit enterprise, and the entire neighborhood was her captive market. A new kind of energy surged through me, burning away the despair. It wasn't about my wall or the fines anymore. This was bigger. This was about stopping her before she caused a real catastrophe, a fire, a widespread blackout in the middle of winter. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. I knew I couldn't prove it with soil samples or historical codes. I needed something direct, something undeniable. I needed to show, not tell. My mind raced back to Dr. Miles. Why would he betray me? Karen must have offered him something, or threatened him. I pulled up the contact information for his daughter, Sarah, a lawyer I had met a few times over the years. I hesitated. Calling her felt like crossing a line, bringing his family into this mess. But I was out of options. I called her. Her voice was cold. "I know why you're calling, Alex. My father, he's not well. Early-stage Alzheimer's. He's lucid most of the time, but he gets confused. A very persuasive woman from his new retirement community's resident council convinced him he was helping to protect the community from a dangerous individual. She had him sign a document he didn't fully understand. My blood ran cold. Karen hadn't just used him. She had preyed on a sick old man. "He's devastated," Sarah continued, her voice cracking. "He keeps saying, 'The earth doesn't lie, but I did.'" That was all I needed to hear. My anger toward my mentor evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Sarah agreed to draft a new affidavit, explaining her father's medical condition and the circumstances of the first signing. It wouldn't win the case, but it would neutralize her key piece of character assassination. It put the ball back in my court. Now, for the main event. I needed to prove the connection between the water and the electrical failures. I needed a live test, but more dramatic, more definitive than the green dye. I spent the next 2 days buried in electrical engineering manuals and utility grid schematics that Henderson, with his network of old-timer contacts, managed to dig up for me. And I found it. A beautiful, elegant, and perfectly legal way to expose the entire scam in one spectacular moment. The county had an old, rarely used ordinance that allowed a resident to request an independent load and safety audit of the grid infrastructure serving their property if they could demonstrate a persistent safety concern. It was a bureaucratic loophole designed for extreme cases, and a $40,000 lien and a threat of forced sale were pretty extreme. I filed the request, citing power fluctuations and attaching the new affidavit from Sarah about Dr. Miles, painting a picture of a targeted campaign of harassment based on falsified evidence. To my surprise, the county, likely smelling a lawsuit, agreed. They scheduled the audit for Saturday, during the neighborhood's annual fall potluck, on the park lawn, the very same stage as my last performance. Karen couldn't stop it. It was an official county action. She sent out a notice framing it as a proactive community partnership to ensure grid safety, trying to co-opt the narrative. But I could feel her panic. This time, the test wouldn't be on her terms. It would be run by certified county engineers, and I knew exactly what they were going to find. I spent the night before the audit not sleeping, but in my garage, assembling my visual aid. It was simple. A portable spectrum analyzer, a laptop, and a high-gain antenna. I wasn't going to show them the problem. I was going to let them hear it. The fall potluck was a tense affair. The air was thick with the smell of grilled hot dogs and unspoken anxiety. Karen was there, of course, projecting an aura of supreme confidence, but I could see the tightness around her eyes. The 2 county engineers arrived in a white utility van, looking bored. They set up their equipment near the main transformer box at the edge of the park. My stage was set. They began their standard load test, running diagnostics. The lead engineer, a man with a tired face, announced, "Initial readings are within normal parameters. A little fluctuation, but nothing out of spec." Karen shot me a triumphant smirk. The crowd of neighbors started to relax. They were ready to believe it was all in my head again. That was my cue. I stepped forward. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice calm, "you're measuring the output, but the problem isn't the output, it's the interference." I brought out my laptop and the spectrum analyzer. "If you'll allow me." I powered it on, and a low hum filled the air, broadcast through a small speaker. On the laptop screen, a flat green line appeared. "This is the normal electromagnetic field of the power lines. Clean. 60 hertz. I looked directly at Karen. "But that's not what's really happening in our ground, is it?" I nodded to Henderson, who was standing near a sprinkler control valve 50 yards away. He turned the valve. You could hear the hiss of water flooding the underground pipes, feeding the saturated soil right beneath our feet. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The hum from my speaker was steady. The line on the screen was flat. I heard someone snicker. Karen's smirk widened. Then the hum began to change. It started as a subtle crackle, like static on an old radio. The green line on my screen started to twitch. As the ground became more saturated, the crackle grew into a loud, angry buzz. The clean line on the screen dissolved into a chaotic, jagged mess of spikes. "What you're hearing," I announced to the silent crowd, "is called ground fault induction. It's what happens when you run a high-voltage electrical grid through a swamp. The water is causing a constant low-level short circuit across the entire system." The lead engineer's face went pale. He was staring at his own equipment, which was now flashing red alerts. "His readings they're accurate. The whole grid is unstable. It's a miracle there hasn't been a fire." And then I delivered the final, killing blow. "And I wonder," I said, pulling a folded document from my pocket, "if it has anything to do with this." It was a copy of the Articles of Incorporation for the contractor Karen had been using exclusively. It shows that the primary shareholder of Reliable Contracting LLC is a holding company. I paused, letting the silence stretch. A holding company registered to Karen's maiden name. The gasp from the crowd was a physical thing. It was all there. The motive, the mechanism, the crime. She wasn't just a corrupt president. She was the owner of the company fixing the problems she was creating. The aftermath was swift. The county launched a full-scale investigation. The developer pulled out. The bank froze her assets. The homeowners association was placed in receivership. Karen was facing a mountain of civil and criminal charges. My fines were voided, and the board was forced to issue a public apology. But my victory came with a price. My house was no longer a home. It was a battleground, a monument to a war I never wanted to fight. The neighborhood, facing months of legitimate, expensive repairs, was fractured. I had won their safety, but I had lost their trust. In the end, I had a choice: stay and be the man who saved the neighborhood but broke it, or leave and let them heal. I put the house on the market a week later. Before I left, I did one last thing. I took my old Istwing hammer, the one my mentor gave me, and I walked over to the pile of rubble that was once my wall. I found the most perfect hand-cut cornerstone, and I set it right at the corner of the property line, firm in the earth. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a marker, a reminder that the earth doesn't lie, and eventually, neither can the people who walk on it. I left the hammer resting on top of the stone, a final, silent gesture, and I drove away without looking back.